questions arise about what will this administration look like on key civil liberties and national security issues. Biden, as a senator, was instrumental in the passage of bills escalating the war on drugs and mass incarceration. During a floor debate, he urged the passage of the U.S. Patriot Act, claiming the FBI could wiretap the mafia but not terrorists. That quote, by the way, is still up on the Department of Justice's website on a page extolling the virtues of Patriot Act surveillance. Biden began advocating for regime change in Iraq as early as 1998, and as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in 2002, he was key to selling the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But it is neither the year of 1994 nor the year of 2002. And in 2020, Americans are deeply disillusioned with the war on terror, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and mass surveillance. So it's unsurprising that during the campaign, Biden struck a bit of a different note. He promised to repeal the Muslim ban on day one, to end countering violent extremism, to rejoin the Iran nuclear agreement, and to end, quote unquote, the forever war. A key indicator of what an administration's policies will look like, though, however, is who is on their transition team. To discuss this, we are joined again by a longtime friend of Defending Rights Dissent, Kevin Gosztola. Kevin is the managing editor of Shadowproof and the co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosures podcast. He has been tracking very closely the appointments to the Biden-Harris transition team, including the agency review teams, as well as the national security advisors. His latest piece appeared on The Gray Zone, and it's entitled, Biden's Transition Team is Filled with War Profiteers, Beltway Chicken Hawks, and Corporate Consultants. Kevin, thank you again for joining us, I think the third time this year.
Yeah, no, it's great to talk to you.
So we'll get into some of the specifics in a minute, but overall, in terms of the transition team, what does it look like from a civil liberties perspective?
Yeah, so when you look at the agency review teams that are relevant, particularly the people who are going to be staffing the Justice Department, and you look at the people who are from the intelligence community review team, then you see that these are people who have a belief in the expansion of mass surveillance. They believe that it has in fact been expanded in such a way that is within the boundaries of the law. These are people who are on the record as individuals involved in attacking and trying to discredit NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. You also have the presence of people like Marty Latterman, who was involved in the drone memo that was specifically drafted to target Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen for the purpose of creating this legal basis, almost out of thin air, that the United States could target and assassinate a person without having to capture them and bring them back and put them on trial for terrorism offenses, and stretching the legal definition for imminence to a degree that it almost had no meaning. So you see that there are people on these teams who have histories of not really believing that they needed to cater to civil liberties matters. You know, these are individuals, I will get into more specifics, but these are people who have connection to torture in wars of the past decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are people who were advocates for the way in which we all have been organized in the post 9/11 world.
Sure. So let's dig into some of those specifics. One of the issues you and I have discussed in this format, at least in the past, has been the prosecution of Julian Assange and the larger war on whistleblowers and journalists. So who on the Biden transition team is implicated in these issues, and what does it say about how a Biden-Harris administration might treat whistleblowers?
I believe that Neil McBride is probably the one that is most crucial to examine. He was in the Eastern District of Virginia as the U.S. Attorney. He's a Biden ally. In fact, he goes all the way back to the late 1980s as someone who worked with Joe Biden. He was part of Joe Biden's campaign, which we know ended largely due to some of his own missteps, but also he was accused of plagiarism. Remember that Joe Biden, yeah. And so Neil McBride is someone who empaneled the grand jury against WikiLeaks and was overseeing that grand jury investigation. It did not indict Julian Assange before he resigned in mid-2013, but nonetheless, he was okay with going after anyone associated with this media organization and allowing the national security apparatus to collect and go through all these materials, private materials, for people who were interested of WikiLeaks. We also know that McBride, I'm getting a kind of some feedback in my ear of me talking, and it's a little bit distracting. Just seeing if we can. Thanks. Yeah. So there are two major leak prosecutions that were overseen by Neil McBride as well, and they were against CIA whistleblowers. One against John Kiriakou, who's well known for speaking out against waterboarding by the Bush administration, came after him under the Espionage Act, and eventually he pled guilty to another offense. But then there's Jeffrey Sterling, who is a CIA whistleblower as well, someone who actually challenged racial discrimination within the CIA. And then because he had had communication with New York Times reporter James Risen, he ultimately became the one that was pegged as the source for information for Risen's book on the Bush administration and their violation of civil liberties and the expansion of war. James Risen was subpoenaed, and Neil McBride aggressively in the courts fought to force James Risen to divulge information on who his confidential sources were in order to prosecute Jeffrey Sterling. And he was willing to put James Risen in jail in order to force him to reveal his source. And he doesn't believe he went overboard. I note in my article that in the Aspen Security Forum, he was asked by Michael Isikoff a very appropriate question, do you think you've gone too far? And he said no, and they act like they were restrained. I want to be very clear about the nature of the Obama administration's crackdown on leaks. They were deliberately looking to make an example out of people. That's how fed up they were. And I think to describe it in that way, you might think about the last 4 years under Donald Trump's administration and how vengeful they have been towards leakers. And I'd say, if you take the rhetoric out of it, it's almost identical to the attitude that the administration had against leakers or whistleblowers. Maybe they weren't as filled with vengeance, and maybe they didn't express that spirit openly, but certainly Obama had a lot of animosity towards anyone who would stray from the certain lines that were supposed to be held to when it came to war and national security.
Sure, and sorry about the feedback. So in recent years, we've seen increased pushback against surveillance. For example, the current Congress is having a bit of difficulty renewing Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Where does the Biden-Harris transition team shape up in terms of issues pertaining to mass surveillance?
To me, I think the name that I find most important in the agency review teams was that there's an individual named Matt Olson who is listed there, who used to be the Counterterrorism Center, the National Counterterrorism Center head. And Matt Olson actually advocated for backdoor searches. And what resulted was at Just Security, you had Mike German, who's a former FBI agent, and then Elizabeth Gauthier, who is with the Brennan Center for Justice, who came together to rebut the argument he was putting forward, which essentially was that if the FBI had to follow the Fourth Amendment and had to abide by a restriction of probable cause, that the entire way of investigating national security offenses would just all fall apart. They were suggesting that they just couldn't do it. And so Mike German and Elizabeth Gauthier had looked at this closely and made it clear that there were several different ways that you could still investigate these crimes without having to violate people's privacy, and to pick that apart. He is someone who, in the 2000s, broke down this barrier that had been in place to prevent information from clandestine operations and warrantless wiretapping from making it into the hands of prosecutors for their cases, on the off chance that that information would be tainted and would end up tainting that trial that was being brought against someone who was a criminal defendant. So I think every step of the way, he's been someone who has represented how far they think this, surveillance can go, and that there really aren't any boundaries when it comes to what this information can be used for. And he attacked Edward Snowden. I mean, to be clear, he said that Edward Snowden was responsible for the fact that members of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups were changing their tactics, and so the U.S. government couldn't find them. I mean, you're asking us to all think stupid if that's the way you're going to attack somebody, because anybody, regardless of what group they're in, knows that, if they want to have privacy, there are these tools available and they can have it. Anybody who wants to do anything private can do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, it's criminal to convince the world that they should use encryption in order to protect their communication.
So one of the most shocking aspects of the Obama-Biden administration was the escalation of what's euphemistically called targeted killings, what human rights experts call extrajudicial executions in the form of drone strikes. This includes the extrajudicial execution of a U.S. citizen. An understated story of the Trump era has been Donald Trump's own dramatic escalation of U.S. drone strikes and U.S. air wars. What does the transition team tell us about what targeted killings might look like under the Biden-Harris administration?
Yeah, so I think we have a news peg for our discussion. We've heard in the last week these rumblings about troops being withdrawn from Afghanistan. And, on one hand, I think Trump might win some praise from people who have wanted to see the war wind down. But also, I've seen it put another way, that in fact, there are people within the Pentagon who are preparing for the kind of smart war, I put that in quotes, strategy that Obama favored, where you send in the special operations forces or you send in the drones to conduct these strikes and or raids against targets, militants that are put on kill lists. And certainly when you look at the list of people that Biden is inviting, these are people responsible for revolutionizing what Jeremy Scahill paid very close attention to and meticulously reported on about a decade ago, the assassination policy of President Barack Obama's administration. You have individuals like William McRaven that are providing national security briefings, who were in on the Terror Tuesday meetings with John Brennan, putting together kill lists with baseball cards and passing around these individuals and deciding who was going to live and die every other week. And these are people who are, McRaven himself has blood on his hands. I noted in my recent dive into the people who are providing the briefing that the Al-Majala massacre that took place in Yemen ended up killing 41 civilians, 22 children. It was absolutely a horrifying scene that was described by witnesses who went to see the carnage. They believed that there was a target there, but that camp had nothing to do with any terrorists at all. And it's sort of, I know that what you're referring to with the increased attention to Trump's drone policy compared Obama's administration to Trump and said that each one of them actually has a horrific kind of a massacre that kicked off their own use of drones during their administrations. And Obama's is Al-Majala. And Bill McRaven was involved in that. We also know that we have Stanley McChrystal, a retired general, who is advising Joe Biden. And there's more that can be said about him, certainly, but just to keep it about drones, I mean, he's with JSOC, and so I mean he's the one who is, I don't, to get away from just focusing on the technology that's being used. The important thing is that it's for the purposes of assassinating individuals, of believing that you can go into any regions or parts of any country and take out people. And so these special operations forces that are carrying out these raids, that's something that was systematized by Stanley McChrystal. And so I think, the difference here when we're looking at it from, a civil liberties standpoint is that the Bush administration would have us do nation building, or we do massive military occupations and we build wars around that, and then we would change our way of life in order to support that. The Obama administration and more liberal Democrats, so to speak, believe that we don't really need to make sacrifices. There's ways that we can do this without having major footprints. There might be some things that change in our society, but by and large, we could send in these stealth teams and just take out people. And we never really know if they're actually the people the government claims that they are, because there's a lot of secrecy that is usually used to conceal. Trump did put the drone program under the military within much more secrecy than what existed under Obama. He went backwards in terms of the transparency. So we'll see if Biden keeps that secrecy. But this is something that, I think we're going to see a return to the Obama era where there were assassinations happening on a regular basis.
So you mentioned that there's a lot of hubbubaloo about Trump possibly withdrawing some troops from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. We've also heard reports that Trump considered striking Iran, which is very alarming. And, Trump, like Biden during the campaign, criticized quote unquote forever wars or endless wars. But we know he, during his time, dramatically escalated U.S. regime change efforts, especially sanctions against Venezuela and Iran. He reversed the sort of limited rapprochement of the Obama years between the U.S. and Iran and Cuba. And when it comes to issues of war and peace and what the role of the U.S. should do in the world, where do the people on the transition team stand?
Yeah, so the people on Biden's transition team believe in the utility of sanctions to be imposed on populations, particularly in countries that we've decided to oppose. And so, what that means, most likely the people of China will be able to absorb any kinds of sanctions. But what it does mean is that, you see these people favoring the ramping up of tensions with Russia to impose sanctions, favoring sanctions against Venezuela. We've seen the brutal impact of that. But then I think most staggeringly, we've seen what sanctions have meant for Iran. We've seen how it has made it nearly impossible for the government to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, to provide health care, to get aid and supplies into the country. They've put people on blacklists, and the U.S. government, through the Trump administration, by abandoning that Iran nuclear deal, has been aggressively trying to box in Iran. And I note that there are actually people in Biden's transition team who believe that Iran has not done enough. There's one individual, Bob Work, who was in the Trump administration, who's providing briefings, who said at a think tank event, I believe it's CNAS, that it was Center for New American Security, that had hosted it just a day or two ago. He said that Iran is continuing to march toward a nuclear weapon with no evidence whatsoever to back up that claim, and that will be a very, very high priority for the Biden administration to stop. I mean, that sounds like something that Mike Pompeo would say as Secretary of State. And so for people who believe we're going to see a return to the Iran nuclear deal, for people who believe that there's going to be diplomacy and a pursuit of peace in order to dial back the tensions that have been ramped up by the Trump administration, it's very concerning, in fact, jarring, to hear people say things that, just to throw out the title of a book that someone I respect put together and spent the time doing journalism. Gareth Porter has a book on called Manufactured Crisis on the Iran nuclear scare, documenting the ways in which time and time again we've heard exaggerations from the U.S. government about what Iran was up to with its nuclear program, a program that for the most part they wanted to peacefully be able to have their own energy resource so that they could power their country. And yet they've been treated despicably by us in a way that has made the region much less safe for people, and has definitely intensified conflicts in countries throughout the Middle East.
So, who is the most concerning figure on the transition team to you?
Well, I mean, having done the dive that I did in the last 24 hours over people who are advising Joe Biden, I think Stanley McChrystal is easily the one that I would pick out as an abominable figure. He covered up the death of Pat Tillman, and that was a former NFL player who was killed in combat in Afghanistan. But also, Stanley McChrystal is implicated in a major torture scandal at Camp Nava, and it's detailed in Jeremy Scahill's book. He denied that there was ever systemic torture there, and yet we have a CIA general counsel on record saying that when he went there, there were torture techniques being used that went well beyond what the CIA was even using at that time. This was in 2003 and 2004 in Iraq. And McChrystal was in charge of JSOC. He oversaw this camp. He knew that there was brutality there. In his memoir, he denied that there was any kind of this activity going on. There are horrific examples that are in Dirty Wars. I encourage people to go back to some of the literature that they bought during the Obama administration and look at it closely, because it contains stories that are going to be we're going to see a ripple effect from what those actions were and how things were carried out, because Joe Biden is bringing on all these people who had staffed the Obama administration. And so, anything that we found concerning 5 and 10 years ago, it seems like we're going to have echoes from those acts in a Biden administration. And so I'm concerned about the presence of Stanley McChrystal as a voice who is considered a reasonable person, especially since he despises Muslims. It's written very clearly in Jeremy Scahill's book that he fervently believed that Muslims were trying to construct a caliphate, and that no matter what, the military, and I presume he would say that the national security apparatus should use whatever means necessary in order to prevent the being gauged by these people who are trying to dominate the globe. So he has that kind of crusader mentality that was a hallmark of the Bush administration.
So my final question, and I'm afraid of what the answer is because I suspect it's going to be depressing. Are there any bright spots on the transition team at all?
Oh, I mean, there are people here and there that, well, what if I tell you that there's someone who I think is a complex figure, and it's possible that she could be a measured voice potentially. Avril Haines is listed here. The problem I have with her is that she was a big supporter of Gina Haspel becoming the CIA director. And I'm concerned about the way in which, I'll put it very boldly here, I'm concerned about the way in which we might be rewarding people who are women or people of color who are still willing to uphold the white male patriarchy, basically. This whole thing of that, like, we can't criticize the warmongers if they happen to be women or people who are not white skinned, is something that I think is going to really give us a lot of problems going forward if we don't maintain our clarity. But Avril Haines is on the record saying that she's concerned or was concerned about the way in which the drone program was massively expanded under Obama. And apparently, as a figure within the Obama administration, was telling people things were illegal when there were certain strikes that were ordered, and was trying to bring some restraint. She knew she wasn't going to be able to abolish the military drone program, probably wasn't going to get the CIA to end its drone program, but she was concerned about it enough that she was trying to force legal restrictions on the administration that they would follow more closely. And it did lead to a diminishing of the number of strikes. So you saw less strikes because the rules were saying you had to be more deliberate about the targets that you chose. And so I think, if there's anything, the presence of people like that who can pull back, that'd be good. I'm just concerned that there's a lot of figures from the Obama administration that have been gung-ho and have been willing to push the limit. And I don't see Biden being the kind of figure that has the sort of charisma that Barack Obama had in order to deny them or to defy them when they are lobbying aggressively. I mean, there's a very famous moment with Samantha Power, who was in favor of regime change wars in Libya and Syria, where this was reported by Jeffrey Goldberg for The Atlantic, where she's talking about, what she wants to happen in Syria. And Obama says something to the effect of, "I've already read your book, so shut up, just stop pushing me to go for more war." And, this is someone who wanted to avoid congressional authorization for going to war in Syria, which is, obviously something I think anyone listening to our discussion would be very concerned about. If we're going to go to war, it has to be supported by all three branches, or it has to be co-signed by the legislative branch along with the executive branch. It can't just be a unilateral decision. So, if there are voices that are restraining voices, people who can temper the kind of action we see going forward, that would be ultimately good.
Kevin, thank you so much for spending time with us. It is always a pleasure when you share your wealth of knowledge with us. People who want to read Kevin's work, he is the managing editor of Shadowproof, which I believe is shadowproof.com. He also has a Substack, the Dissenter Substack, which I have subscribed to, and there's some really great exclusive content on there. I would encourage, if you could, to subscribe to that. His current article on Biden's transition team is up on the Gray Zone. And for people who want to learn more about Rights and Dissent, please visit us at rightsandDissent.org, where you can find the video of this and the video of past events with Kevin and other great speakers. Have a good day, everyone, and thank you for spending your lunch with us.